So in the summer of 2016, something happened that had never really happened before. A video game broke the real world.
For 30 years, people have been playing with Pokemon on their screens, but now the creatures have jumped from their world into ours. The latest craze for Queenslanders is catching these creatures on our smartphones. And even if you're not into the game, you're going to come across plenty of people.
Not in a metaphorical sense, people were trespassing into zoos. Two guys fell off a 90-foot cliff in California. A man in Baltimore drove his car into a parked police cruiser. Two Canadian teenagers accidentally crossed an international border. And somewhere in a rebel-controlled town in Syria, a man was standing in the rubble with his phone out trying to catch a Snorlax. This is the story of Pokemon Go. To understand why the launch of Pokemon Go hit the way it did, you have to understand the confluence of things that made it possible. By 2016, smartphones were everywhere. Augmented reality had been talked about for years, but never really delivered on in promised form to normal people. And Pokemon, the franchise that had been quietly humming along since the 90s, was sitting on decades of accumulated nostalgia, waiting for the right moment. Niantic, the developer behind the game, had actually done a dry run with an earlier AR game called Ingress. It worked out the bones of what could become Pokemon Go. Walking to physical locations to capture points, building a real-world map of landmarks. The difference was that Ingress was a game for a niche audience. Pokemon Go was a game everyone who had ever been a kid in the late 90s could enjoy. The game launched on July 6, 2016, first in the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Within a week, it had been downloaded over 10 million times. Within 19 days, it crossed 50 million downloads, a milestone that the previous record holders, Color Switch and Slither.io, took over 2.5 months to reach. In 3 weeks, Pokemon Go surpassed Instagram's entire 6-month download total. In its first month, it generated $207 million in revenue. These are numbers that sound made up, yet they are not. The game hit the top of the App Store charts in every single country where it launched. Nintendo's stock price jumped to nearly 100% in the days after release before investors realized a little embarrassingly that Nintendo wasn't actually the developer and didn't own the majority of the profits. The stock pulled back, the game did not. What made it special wasn't just the numbers. It was what it looked like in the streets. Central Park in New York City became a hotspot with hundreds of people sprinting towards the same corner with rare Pokemon spawned. Santa Monica Pier was overrun. Parks that had been quiet for years suddenly had crowds at midnight. People were out, moving around, talking to strangers. It was the rare mobile gaming phenomenon that actually got people off the couch and into the real world. There's a famous story from that summer of a man in New York who ran through Central Park yelling that there was a Vaporeon nearby, and the entire crowd started chasing him. That video spread everywhere, and it kind of captured the whole vibe. This complete suspension of normal social behavior in service of catching a cartoon water dinosaur cat dog thing. Nobody thought it was weird, everyone just ran. But the craze had a darker side, and it came fast. Because the game required you to physically go places, and because it was compelling enough that people stopped paying attention to their surroundings, accidents started piling up almost immediately. The two men who fell off the cliff in Encinitas, California, they survived, but they fell 80 to 90 feet. A Reddit post on the day of release already had a user saying Pokemon Go put them in the emergency room, having fractured a bone in their foot within 30 minutes of downloading the app. The poster told the doctors they were walking their dog. Criminals caught on quickly. In Missouri, armed robbers figured out they could drop a lure in an isolated Pokestop, a feature in the game that attracts Pokemon to a location, then wait for distracted players to show up. It worked. Robberies like this were repeated across the country within the first 2 weeks. In Ohio, 2 adults broke into a zoo after hours specifically to hunt Pokemon. When they were caught, they told reporters their biggest regret was that they would no longer be able to control the gym at the zoo. The gym, not the arrest. Not the trespassing charge, the gym. A man in Nebraska playing at 2 in the morning accidentally interfered with a police search for a murder suspect. A police dog being used to track the suspect got thrown off by the scents of the nearby Pokemon Go players. Some players locked themselves inside a graveyard. 5 teenagers were found inside a closed elementary school. British police logged hundreds of incidents, robberies using in-game lures, kids trespassing on railway tracks, a man who had invited children to his home by advertising he had a lot of Pokemon at his address. And then there were the Canadians. 2 teenagers from Alberta were so absorbed in the game they had walked south across the US border into Montana without realizing it. A Border Patrol agent had to stop them. They had no idea they'd crossed international lines. The game became such a flashpoint that Niantic added in-game warning messages reminding people to be aware of their surroundings. This was considered a reasonable and necessary feature for a game about catching monsters. By August 2016, the initial peak had passed. The player count dropped dramatically. Estimates put the decline at around 70% of the original base just within the first year. Critics declared it a fad. The hot take of late 2016 was that Pokemon Go was over. But that turned out to be wrong. What actually was the initial explosion shook off the casual downloaders, leaving behind a core that was genuinely invested. Niantic kept building. They added trading, PvP battles, raid mechanics that required real-world coordination, and an entire seasonal event structure. The game found a rhythm. By 2020, during COVID lockdowns, Pokemon Go had a counterintuitive resurgence. Niantic temporarily relaxed the distance requirements to allow people to play from home, and the player base spiked yet again. The game's most profitable year ever was 2020. By 2025, Pokemon Go had over 115 million monthly active players. The 2024 Go Fest event in Osaka drew over 120,000 attendees, with tickets selling out months in advance. Similar events in Berlin and San Francisco followed. The game has generated over $6 billion in lifetime revenue. Niantic, which was valued at $150 million before the game launched, hit a valuation of $9 billion by 2021. It's a genuinely unusual story for a mobile game, which tends to burn bright and disappear. Most of the big titles from 2016 are gone or irrelevant. Pokemon Go is still putting up numbers that would make new games envious. Part of that is the Pokemon brand itself, which has never stopped being culturally relevant, but part of it is that the game did something that most games don't. It changed real behavior. It got people walking, created actual social rituals, local communities, reasons to go outside. That's a harder thing to replicate than just a good game design. The summer of 2016 was genuinely unlike anything that had happened in gaming before. The combination of AR technology, smartphone ubiquity, and Pokemon nostalgia created a window that has never quite opened the same way since. For a few months, an entire generation was wandering around parks and parking lots at midnight, staring at their phones, completely unbothered by how strange it must have looked to everyone else. And if you were one of those people, like me, if you remember sprinting toward a fountain because someone in the group chat said there was a Dragonite, you know exactly why it happened. It felt like the world had finally caught up to something that we'd been promised since we were kids.